Hi, this is Mrs. Camp again. I am covering AP World History Modern 5.8 Reactions to the Industrial Economy. Now I am doing part 2 of a two-part presentation. This is covering reactions and their effects. So we're starting here with three major categories: regulation, economics, and alternative views of society. I will go through each of these one at a time, and then I will have one slide summing up what happened as a result of all of these efforts. So first, let's go into regulation. Okay, we've got labor unions, we've got working hours, we've got pay, we've got working conditions. Okay, we've got political reforms with voting rights for working class, and then child labor, and we have both the Factory Acts and an Elementary Education Act there. So let's take a look at labor unions. There are three main issues that labor unions focused on: working hours, pay, and working conditions. Unionization happened different times at different countries, sometimes a little more peacefully and sometimes a lot more violently. Two examples in the United States are the Haymarket Affair and the Pullman Strike. So last time we looked at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, the result of this was a call for labor unions. One example is Rose Schneiderman. She was a union activist and gave a speech largely to the Women's Trade Union League. She used the fire as an argument for factory workers to organize, get together, and collectively bargain, create labor unions. An excerpt of her speech: "I would be a traitor to these poor burned bodies if I came here to talk good fellowship. We have tried you, good people of the public, and we have found you wanting. We have tried you, citizens. We are trying you now. And you have a couple of dollars for the sorrowing mothers, brothers, sisters, by way of a charity gift. But every time the workers come out in the only way they know to protest against conditions which are unbearable, the strong hand of the law is allowed to press down heavily upon us. Public officials have only words of warning to us, warning that we must be intensely peaceable, that they have the workhouse just at the back of all their warnings. The strong hand of the law beats us back when we rise into conditions that make life unbearable. I can't talk fellowship to you who are gathered here. Too much blood has been spilled. I can know from my experience, it is up to the working people to save themselves. The only way they can save themselves is by a strong working class movement." Moving on to political reforms. Voting rights. In 1780, less than 3% of people could vote in England and Wales, and in Scotland at that point, it was less than 1%. It was at this time that societies really started forming to promote what they called universal manhood suffrage. There are several organizations. Among these are the Sheffield Corresponding Society, the London Corresponding Society, and the Chartists. So here you can see a sign that was posted trying to organize people to get together and demand rights. Here, this is a picture of the Peterloo Massacre, where there was a peaceful gathering of people at a political meeting, and the local constabulary came in and killed 11 people. As a result of this, Parliament passed repressive acts banning this sort of gathering. And going on, there were multiple reform acts, but it wasn't till 1918 that all males got the right to vote in Britain. Some women did gain the right to vote at that point, and there was a step forward for women in 1918. But at that point, the limits came off for men. We'll talk more about women and voting in further units. In the U.S., the U.S. was somewhat less directly tied to reform and the Industrial Revolution. We had the Civil War, and at the end of that, men could vote, and women could not vote until the 19th Amendment, which was ratified in 1920. Child labor. There are a series of acts passed in Britain that addressed the issue of child labor, conditions, education, and age. We have the first big act that made a difference, 1833 Factory Act. Now, everything wasn't solved as a result of this, and not all of it was followed through by different factories, but we now have legislation that also has inspectors, and they can enforce the law. But prior to this, we have not had that. Here we have a limit on how old children must be, how many hours a day they can work, that children can't work at night, 2 hours of schooling required. So this is some pretty significant steps forward. In 1842, this act was aimed at mines. This now said no women or females could be employed underground, so no girls, and no child under 10 years old was to be employed underground. In the last part of this 5.8, we looked at the situation for children working underground, and specifically we had a primary source from a 17-year-old. So there are more factory acts. Working hours are limited to 10. No person could under 21 could work. Later we have one that says 18. And all of these acts, not this one, but all of the factory acts are repealed and consolidated. So we've taken them all, put them in one. The provisions were similar, but now we have an act that applies to multiple industries and takes the more progressive legislation and puts that into place. If we have something that says no child workers under 9, and then we have working, and then we have somewhere else that maybe the age year is different, they generally went with the protection of the children. So we're now looking at education for children. In 1833, the Factory Act did require 2 hours of schooling each day. 1878, education was mandatory by age, 2 hours or half a day. And in 1880, there was an act passed that every child between 5 and 10 must attend school. Problem with this is that prior to this, there was not free education. So at this point, the British government has to provide some sort of free education. So we've gone from just those who could afford it to all children being able to. So let's move on to utilitarianism. This is John Stuart Mill. So John Stuart Mill developed an idea called utilitarianism. He did not like what was going on under laissez-faire capitalism, Laissez-faire, if you remember, is where the government stays out of the economy. They do not get involved. Mill, however, wanted reform. He supported labor unions, the working on child labor issues, working conditions, all of these things he addressed. He developed his own economic theory, utilitarianism, which is still taught today, and ideas from it are carried through to today. The idea is that people are driven by utility, the benefits of something to them, and that under his theory, we're trying to achieve the greatest good for the greatest number of people. In his book, Utilitarianism, Mill says the utilitarian morality does recognize in human beings the power of sacrifice their own greatest good for the good of others. It only refuses to admit that the sacrifice itself is a good, a sacrifice which does not increase or tend to increase the sum total of happiness it considered as wasted. And when we have the sum total of happiness here, what we're looking at there is the adding up of everybody's happiness. So if you're losing a little bit of your good helps the greater good, then it's useful. If it doesn't, then it's wasted. So let's take a look at socialism, communism. A oft quoted passage, Karl Marx, "Workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains." So Marx really saw industrial capitalism as unstable and as inherently not good for people. He believed that there would be a people's revolution. People would rise up when they realized what was happening to them. They would create a classless society, and that would end the conflict between rich and poor. There would be social equality. So main concepts here are a classless society, common ownership of resources, no private property, and social equality. So this inspired a lot of worker movements throughout Europe, as well as some in the United States. They created socialist parties, they would contest elections, they promoted reform, and sometimes even they would plot revolution. Okay, a little bit of vocabulary you need to know to understand Marx. The proletariat is the working class, okay, the lower classes of society. The bourgeoisie, while in France, in the French Revolution, they refer to the bourgeoisie being more the middle class. Here we're talking about the upper classes, the capitalists, those who will gain off of the work of the proletariat. This is a passage from Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, published in 1848, where he outlines the class struggles, provides evidence for his claim that the history of all society is the history of class struggles. Here he talks about how the masses of laborers crowded their slaves, and he says of the bourgeois class, the bourgeois state, and they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, the overlooker, and above all, the individual bourgeois manufacturer. So from this, he's saying that the workers sink lower, and once they become a pauper, they become very poor. That becomes something that they're aware of, and society cannot function under this situation. So then later in the manifesto, they make clear their position, which I'm going to just read this. In short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing political and social order of things. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by a forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions, a revolution. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. So as you can see, he is making the argument and then telling us what his solution and the solution that he considers a communist solution will be, which is the revolution of the proletariat. So now we've looked at the calls for reform and some of the reforms that were enacted, laws that were enacted, and writings that came out, Mill's utilitarianism, Marx's socialism and communism of the presentation.